All right. It looks like maybe we are live. All right. Good morning, everyone, or good day, because I know people join from all over the world. And I'd just like to say welcome. I'm so happy that you're here. I'm Diane Harris from Stash Bandit, and we're going to start in just a little bit with a live about Summer Splash. Let me adjust a couple of things here so that I can see you. I want to turn off my closed captions. You can have your captions on if you like. Mine are going to be off. Okay, let me just check that my camera is available. All right, we're good. Okay, it's right at noon here in the Midwest. Welcome. I'm Diane Harris. Welcome to the YouTube channel for thequiltshow.com. I'm in today with the third in a series of mini classes related to Summer Splash, which is a little sampler quilt that I designed for the Quilt Show. They still have the pattern, which you can buy separately, or they have kits in 2 different colorways, and you'll find those under the shop tab at thequiltshow.com. So today we are going to talk about the trickiest block in this little quilt. And it's not horrible, but it goes together a little differently than most quilt blocks do. And so I wanted to show you that. And then I have drafted the block in a new size, and I'll have that for you as a complimentary giveaway. And then we're going to talk about some ideas for quilting Summer Splash. Coming up with what to quilt is always my biggest hurdle. If I know what I'm going to quilt, I can usually execute it in a reasonably okay fashion. It's coming up with what to quilt that is my stumbling block. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today with Summer Splash, but it will be ideas that you can apply to your future work too. So I hope you'll find that to be helpful. All right, so if you're here already and you're live, I would invite you to put into the chat where you're joining us from. We always love to see that. I live in the middle of nowhere in South Central Nebraska, and so I'm on Central Time. It's noon here. And wherever you are, I'm so glad that you've joined us today. And if you're watching the recording, so happy that you're taking it in at your convenience. All right, so I'm going to, did I say my name is Diane Harris? My little business is called Stash Bandit. And sometimes you have so many things in your mind, you can't remember if you said the most important stuff. So there you go. All right, so I'm going to change my camera so that you can see what I'm working on. So I had a little bit of trouble with my normal camera today, so we had to switch it up at the last second, but I think this will work all right. So this is a little block I designed called Stretchy Star, and we're going to talk about how it goes together today. But I want to show you one thing that I have found to be so helpful. So what I did is I made a copy of this, and then I cut out one portion of it, which you can see right here. And what I discovered a few years back is that for a lot of quilt blocks, instead of trying to make this unit in this orientation and then this unit like this and so on, for a lot of quilt blocks, you can make 1/4 of it and you can just make it 4 times in exactly the same way. And then you rotate them in order to build the quilt block. Now, in this case, you can see that for these middle patches, you'll have to make 2 of these units that have yellow at the center and 2 units that have orange at the center, but that's a very minor detail. So the way you can tell if this will work with your quilt block is if somehow you take a picture or get a picture of the block, and then you cut out 1/4 of it like I did here. And then you take that and then you can look at it. Can I just, if I rotate, is it just that same unit 4 times? And a lot of the times it is. And that really simplifies things. If you have any trouble with left and right, or any spatial challenges, or you have any little bit of dyslexia, that really helps. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this unit 4 times, and I'm going to move this sample over so that you can see how I would do that. So the patches that I happened to grab for this demo have light backgrounds. No, they have dark backgrounds and light star points. So this would be my corner, and this would be my star point here. This corresponds to this dark brown. And so what I would do, first of all, is I would get my 4 patches for that corner, and I would get my 4 triangles for right there, and I would make this 4 times to start off. And when you line up a triangle on a square, sometimes people are confused like about the placement. What do I do here? You're going to line up these whole corners, and then you're going to sew right along here. Now, if your machine wants to eat this little triangle, to suck it down into that little hole for the needle, you can turn this over and start stitching here instead. And sometimes people get along a little better. You can also use a little leader, or what people call a spider. So I would do that 4 times until I have that part built. And then let's say my middle portion is like this. So this is going to be my middle portion for this block, this part right here. And so I would sew this to this, and I would do that 4 times. Then I would bring those back, open that up, sew this to this 4 times. So then I have built all 4 of those, and so on. So then my bottom portion, I believe, would be this patch plus just 1 triangle, like so. And so I would do that 4 times. And it's just a little bit simpler to build that unit 4 times than to try and think of this orientation and then this orientation and then this one. It's just simpler, I think, simpler to do it this way. So that's a little tidbit. You see if you can make 1/4 of the block 4 times and make that work. So I wanted to show you for Summer Splash how the little patches look. So the little squares in Summer Splash are called A's. And so each A gets joined to a K, which is the triangle, the right triangle. And so this flips over onto this. You'd sew that 4 times. You'd make this row 4 times and this bottom row 4 times. And I want to show you again, just because sometimes this can be confusing, especially here in the middle. When you see how here this little point goes downward and this little point goes upward, that can be a little bit tricky for people. So just remember that you're going to line up the whole corner, the part of the triangle that has a corner that matches the square. So you would sew like that. And it doesn't matter which one of these triangles you add first. But here for this one, you're going to match up down here. So you would sew this one. So when you make those rows, you will end up with this. Make sure I'm centered in the camera. So I have little rows now. And the instructions in Summer Splash say to press toward the triangles, which most of the time that's what I do. I noticed yesterday that when I built this, I pressed toward the squares. It doesn't matter too much which way you press, but you want to always press the same way as you're making these little parts of the block. Because what you're going to do next is sew these together. And if you press toward the squares, then your seams will nest nicely. Right here, you want those seam allowances to go in opposite directions. I think you can see that. And then you would add this one to the bottom, like so. And those seams will nest real nicely there. So when you sew those seams, so here's what you're building is this little diagonal unit with squares on the ends. When you sew those together, you are going to come out with this little diagonal portion. And you can either trim away these little dog ears or you can leave them in place. I tend to trim them away just to kind of get them out of the way a little bit. So now you have these D patches that you're going to sew to each side of this unit. And this isn't super difficult, but there's one little thing you can do to make it go more smoothly. And that is to fold this triangle in half along its long edge, make a little crease with your thumbnail. You want a little crease right there. And what that's going to do is allow you to center this perfectly, because if you get it off center, you'll have trouble. So there, I've centered that little crease according to that little, see that tiny little point right in there? I'm centering that little crease on that point. And if I see, like, for instance, it's a little short down here, I might just nudge this, slightly pull on that to get it to fit. Sometimes I scooch the whole thing over just 2 threads, and I'm going to sew that seam. And here's another little tip. When you're going to sew that seam, it's a little better if you sew from this side, because you can see then where those threads cross over each other, that's the tip of your square. And if you sew from this side, you can take care not to cut off the tip of your square. So you'd sew with 1/4 of an inch right down here, making sure not to cut off the tip of your square. And then when you open it up, hopefully you'll have a nice point right there. And so you would do the same thing with this second one, folding it in half, making a crease with your thumb nail so that you can center that beautifully right there. And I want to show you one other thing that you might run into. So depending on what kind of a tool you use to cut your triangles, you might have a square like this where one of the tips is cut off. And so when you fold it in half to find the center, you still line everything up just kind of as if that tip was actually there. Don't let that throw you that that little bit is missing. So you would still find the center right there. This one is a little bit bigger. This is for a larger block, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to show you occasionally you might have a tip that's cut off, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. Okay, so once you sew those 2 seams, this is what you will get. And here you would want to measure and make sure that this little unit is 3.5 inches at this point. If it's not, you would want to stop now and adjust. You don't want to just blindly plunge ahead if it's not the right size. So I made 2 of those with the pink centers and 2 with the red centers, and then I sewed the 4 together to get the center of this little block. So at this point, this block, or this portion of the block, should be 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. And then for Summer Splash, you add a little frame around it. So these are going to come out to be 1 inch wide when they're finished. And I didn't have orange in my scrap bag that was enough for all of the strips. So I cut two of the M's from one orange, or an M and an H from this orange, and then an M and an H from this orange. And in a scrap quilt, you can absolutely get by with that. It's no problem at all. In fact, it's a little more interesting. And I usually sew the side ones, the short ones on first, and then I sew the top and the bottom ones on last. You could have two the matching strips be on the sides and then have the top and bottom strips be matching if you preferred that um, instead. So that is how you do the little 6-inch, 6.5 for the center with the little frame. It comes out to be an 8.5-inch unfinished block. So as I was playing with this, I realized how wonderful this block would be if you made it a little bigger. And so I drafted it in a 12-inch size, and I messed around with it a little bit this week. And let me show you how those blocks turned out. And if, tiny, small patchwork isn't your thing, maybe you would enjoy making the block more like this. So this is the same block in a 12-inch finished size. And oh my word, I got super excited about this when I started because I pulled out some little Halloween prints. And then I thought, it might be a lot to have those ghosts in every one of those triangles. So I did 4 triangles with ghosts, and then I found another neutral light and did 4 triangles of that. And I started to have so much fun with this. I got super excited and I decided, you know what, I'm going to create a PDF that you can have at no charge. My gift to you. And the Quilt Show people, Kristen is going to put the link to that in the chat. And so I decided, well, what if I changed it up and made the backgrounds dark and the star parts light? And I threw in a few more fun Halloween prints. So now I have oh my gosh, I can hardly wait to get started on this quilt. I think I'm going to do a little Halloween throw. So I did scrappy star points here, but notice how they're all similarly light. Nothing is too dark that it looks like it doesn't belong. These all look like brothers and sisters, fraternal twins almost. I did 4 matching greens here, 2 different dark neutrals in the center, and 2 clashy oranges up here. This is a real pink. This background color is very salmony, and I love the way it clashes with this rust here. So clashing is where it's at. I'm telling you, you want to embrace a little bit of clash. So then I decided, well, what if I played around a little bit with some blocks in a couple of colors besides the Halloween. So I did this up in EQ, and I decided to add in some kind of red violet, you might call it. So I'm trying to think if that's the color in the color wheel name. I think it is red violet. It's the purple that leans towards red. And so I threw that in a few places and I thought it was really, really interesting. But look what happens when you add some great sashing. Now, this is where my heart started to beat really fast. Some lavender sashing with dark cornerstones I'm sorry, the camera is so wiggly. I will try not to bump it. Lavender sashing, dark cornerstones, kind of a terracotta border color. I could get really excited about this quilt. So I wanted to tell you one other thing about this, and now it escapes. Oh, here, this is what I wanted to say. So when if you decide you'd like to get this complimentary pattern, when you download the PDF, it may print and look a little funky like this. This portion, I couldn't quite get it to obey me. This kept being cut off. So I will get that fixed in the next day or two and get it so that you can download one that's just perfect. But for now, don't panic when you see this little bit of funkiness where some of the parts got a little bit cut off. All right, so that is my stretchy star block, the 6/8 version and the 12-inch version. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this tool. So remember earlier when I said sometimes you will have a half square triangle. Let me grab what I need. Where you have one of the tips cut off. So that happens if you use a tool like this. So the easy angle is one tool that you can use. And what this allows you to do is cut right triangles from, instead of having to cut a 4 7/8 inch square that you then cut in half, you can, from a 4.5 inch strip, cut all of your right triangles. And this is one of the tools that works really great. Another tool that you can use that results in a similar effect is Bonnie Hunter's Essential Triangle tool. So it basically does the same job. It allows you to cut your right triangles from like a 4.5 inch strip instead of having to cut 4 7/8. That's a little more than I have time to explain in detail here, but if you already use these tools, this will make sense to you. And if you don't use them, I would recommend giving them a try. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to, oh, I know one other thing I wanted to talk about. I keep having second thoughts. So I was teaching in Texas this past week. Actually, it's early this week, and a woman asked me, she said, well, what about directional fabrics? Do I need to worry about that? And she was having a big struggle with it. And I really feel like especially if you're making a scrap quilt, and if it's a quilt that doesn't have any kind of an up or down, like there are no baskets in the quilt, for instance, I let directional fabrics go every which way, because if you let them go every which way, then you don't have to fuss. You don't even have to think about it. You just pretend they're not even directional. And then they just go willy-nilly every which way, and it totally doesn't matter. You can see that with the cats here, with the Halloween text. On this one, same thing with the ghosts. You just let them go every which way. And then you can be relaxed about it. And because they're all going different ways, it doesn't matter. It's totally fine. This gal was having a hard time. She just couldn't bring herself to do it. So I said, just try it with one block. Just say, okay, for this one block, I'm just going to let it go. Just try it with one block and see if you can kind of get over the hurdle. And so she tried it with one block, and I think it got a little bit easier for her. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to bring up my mostly quilted summer splash quilt. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. One of the things that I have learned with machine quilting is this. Get this up here is where you can see it, and then I'll move so I'm not wiggling the camera. It really gives added interest to the surface of a quilt if, instead of just quilting like in the seam lines or near the seam lines, you quilt and create new spaces. So for instance, I saw that I could quilt here. There's no seam or anything right in here. So I thought I can connect those corners of those squares, make a big square, and I created a new space. And then I decided to quilt just inside the seam line for this smaller square. It's easier to quilt inside the seam line than it is to quilt in the ditch. Ditch quilting is one of the hardest things to do beautifully because the ditch changes and the ditch moves. But if you quilt just inside, you get a lovely effect without all the difficulty. But that sense of creating a totally new space, that has served me well in quilting. And I did this with a walking foot. Here's another block where I did a very similar thing. So this, I can't remember what this star is called in the pattern, but you can see it's the one that has these real spiky points. And so rather than quilting around those points, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a new space. So I did kind of a shallower V shape here. I just quilted a diagonal line across that square and then repeated those two things as I went all the way around the star. So I created a new space. I created new lines, which become a new part, a new design element, if you will. And so think about where you can create a new space or the illusion of a new space. And then if I wanted to quilt this heavily, one thing I could do is I could quilt this area here down so that this portion, the inner part of the star, puffed up a little bit. It took me a long time to learn that the parts that you do not quilt are what's going to be a little puffier and they'll pop up and catch the light. The parts that you quilt down heavily will recede. They'll sort of like go into the background. And then, let's see, I wanted to talk to you about serpentine stitch. So serpentine stitch is something that's included on a lot of computerized sewing machines. And you sew straight, and the needle does this beautiful back and forth motion. So this is how it would sew. It sews in these little waves like so. And you can just use the edge of your walking foot to create an equal distance between each line of serpentine stitch quilting. So I decided to do one line of serpentine in here. And do you see how the hills and valleys, they're pretty close together? There's only about 3/8 of an inch from the top of this one to the bottom of this one. I know that's kind of hard to see there. Let me bring it a little bit closer. It's pretty narrow. Then up here, I lengthened the hills and valleys so they're a little more gentle. There's a little more space in between them. And so I wanted that little bit of difference between the one in here and the ones out here. When I quilt serpentine stitch, I don't worry too much about the corners. When I get to where my foot is, I have the needle down and I can tell that if I stop with the needle down and rotate the quilt, I'm going to be about where I need to be to start this next line. So you can see each of the pivot points turns out a little bit differently, but in the big picture of the quilt, I don't worry about that. That does not bother me at all. I wanted to show you a different corner. I think, of course, it's the very last one. Yes. So here is where I started. I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer. So I started at this seam. I secured my stitches, and then I quilted serpentine stitch all the way around the quilt. And when I got back to this where I began, I went a little bit past it and did my needle down pivot and continued on around. And so I just continued in concentric rectangles around the quilt until I got to this very last one. Then I just quilt off the edge of the quilt and we're done. So that's just my little method for not having a lot of starts and stops. I start at a seam, I quilt around and around and around and around, and then I get to the last one, I just quilt right off the edge there. And then the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is something I call naturalizing. Let me get this where you can see it. So here are some trees. And so you can see those don't look like real trees. So sometimes when I do the quilting, I quilt a little something that looks a little bit more natural. Like I kind of did a little, uh, just a little wave there across the tops of those trees. And I did the same thing on this set of trees. There we go. Um, I quilted out from those little flying geese triangles, and I quilted kind of what more of a natural shape for the top of that tree. And the same thing with this one. I made the top go like that. So these are very man-made looking shapes. You don't see these perfect shapes like in trees, for instance, so much. You see shapes that are a little more irregular. And so I quilted kind of casually that line there each time. And I like adding a look that gives a little bit more of a natural effect. Here are a couple more little blocks where I kind of created new spaces. I did not quilt in the seam lines. I just did, get that up where you can see it. I just did kind of some new spaces in that little square block. Kind of the same thing here in this little friendship star. I thought, well, a friendship star has these 4 points, but what if I quilted 4 more points? So the quilting is another friendship star that's in a different orientation than the pieced friendship star. So those are just some little things to think about as you quilt your summer splash, and I hope you'll find that to be helpful. Let me get to where I can see you again. There we go. All right. I hope that you'll give Summer Splash a try. It was just a delight to make. I kind of took my time making the first one, the one that has the blue borders, and then I was under the gun a little bit with the deadline for the one that's behind me today, and I sewed that one in about 3 days. Um, I would say take your time and enjoy the process because the fabrics are just gorgeous, and I think you'll enjoy it. When you get to the quilting, remember to try and create some new spaces. Give your serpentine stitch a try and maybe think about naturalizing your trees and your other elements just a little bit. Be sure and click on the link in the chat or it'll also be in the forums at thequiltshow.com so that you can get the 12-inch version of the stretchy star block. I think I'm going to be doing some more videos on my social media, just a few tips for that block. And I'm going to be making a Halloween quilt where I'll post regularly about it. And so if you'd like to check that out, you can. On Instagram, I'm at Stash Bandit Quilts. I do want to give you a peek into something that's coming up. I am doing an online trunk show of my most popular presentation called Make Extraordinary Scrap Quilts on Zoom Tuesday, October 1st at 7 Central. The tickets are $15 on Eventbrite, and it's lots of tips and tricks and some of the biggest things I've learned about scrap quilts and quilting in general over 40 years of quilt making. I have such a good time sharing this with people, and I would welcome you to join me there. So there'll be a link to the tickets in the chat, and I hope you will come. I would love to have you. So my thanks to the people at the Quilt Show for inviting me to do this project with them. They have been a delight to work with. Everything has been smooth as silk from their end, one thing after another. They are top tier pros. So my grateful thanks to them. And thank you for being along, for listening. I hope you'll give Summer Splash a try, and I hope our paths will cross again soon, somewhere down the quilting road. Thank you so much. Have a great day.